turn to the page, and Psalm 1, verses 1 to 6.
Psalm 1, verses 1 to 6. Blessed is the man that walketh not in the counsel of the wicked, nor standeth in the way of sinners, nor sitteth in the seat of scoffers. But his delight is in the law of Jehovah, and on his law doth he meditate day and night. And it should be like a tree planted by the streams of water, that bringeth forth its fruit in its season, whose leaf also doth not wither. And whatsoever he doth shall prosper. The wicked are not so, but are like the chaff which the wind driveth away. Therefore the wicked shall not stand in the judgment, nor sinners in the congregation of the righteous. For Jehovah knoweth the way of the righteous, but the way of the wicked shall perish.
Thanks very much. I was struggling for a title this morning. I tossed between two, didn't I? That man. When I did that, I expected people to turn around behind them. No one moved, and no one's moved tonight either. So you know what's coming. Either that man or such are the godly. I thought of it again this afternoon, and so the title that we'll have is Yes, That Man, but tonight is No, Not This Man. And we'll have a little look at the difference that the psalmist gives. I mentioned this morning that the psalm is not a personal testimony by David of his experience. It's observations that he's made concerning those that follow the Lord and those that don't follow the Lord. And their lifestyle, the life that they live, and then he looks further to see what really is the legacy that they leave behind, and also what happens to them beyond the grave. Because so often everything that we look at seems to head up towards the grave, and we don't like to look beyond what the grave really brings to us. And so this morning, of Yes, That Man, where we looked at the blessedness, both the Authorized and the New King James is very limited what it says. Blessed is the man. It's a generalization in the way they bring it across. But in actual fact, it's an exclamation that's in the plural, and it's very specific. Oh, the blessednesses of that man. It's very, very specific. It's not a generalization. He has seen someone, be it male, female, or be it a group of people together. He has seen them, and they've got something that he also has observed that I'd like to have it too. And we've come across that before, haven't we? We've come across, be it gardens, be it homes, be it cars, be it character, whatever we're talking about. We've come across situations of people we think, oh, I wish I had that. And I think one of the things that attracted me when I first was invited to the church down in Caerphilly, we were looking for a place to be married, and the first night I went there, they had something that I don't think I had. I wasn't positive about it, I wasn't sure of it, but they seemed to have something, this big group of people seemed to have something more than I'd come across before. And certainly when the minister, John Cooper, stood up, Pastor Cooper, he certainly seemed to have something that I'd never been confronted with before. Everything I'd seen before had been the TV poking fun at vicars and reverends or whatever, anything to do with the religious people. Here was a man that stood up, whether he was right or wrong. At that time I didn't know. But whether he was right or wrong, he certainly believed what he was saying. And it made such a difference. And so he observed these things. Oh, the blessednesses. Or as Joseph said this morning, oh, the beauties of that man. And then we looked at the things that he doesn't do, and the things that he does do, and what he's like. Those three things in those three verses deal with that person. It's so positive. He's able to say no. That's one of the things that this blessed man, he is able to say no. In a world where everyone has to say yes now, really. If you say no, people look at you strange. It's a bit distant. That's a bit odd. But this man had no shame in saying, no, I'm not going to go down that road. This is not for me. And then we also find out that he has a pleasure in life. He has a desire. He has a great purpose in life, and that's to please God. The Living Bible brings it out so sweetly. It says concerning this, he meditates upon the Lord day and night, thinking of ways to follow the Lord closely. That's a nice way of putting meditating, because we shrink back from meditating sometimes, don't we? For two reasons. One, we think it's Eastern. It is Eastern. And we struggle with that, think it's a bit spooky. But the other reason is when we begin to meditate, we fall asleep. And it's a discipline that you have to get into. It's not something that comes naturally to us. If you ponder, that's what the word means, to meditate, to ponder. And to speak to yourself. That's what the word actually means, to meditate. To ponder and speak to yourself about ways of serving the Lord more closely and doing what He wants you to do. It's a wonderful way of looking at that verse, isn't it? Then we find out what He's like. He's like a tree that's planted, rooted. He's got foundations. And so everything about Him is positive. Everything about her is positive. Everything about them is positive. They stand out from the crowd. I use Joseph, the son of Jacob, as a little picture of these individuals that seem to have this characteristic. Joseph, he that was separate from his brothers. He was different to his brothers. They were the same blood, the same house. They had the same loves in many ways, but he was different to his brothers. He would not go down the road they were going. His vision was a different vision altogether. And then we find concerning Joseph, whilst he was a man that could say no, even as a youngster, he learned to say no. We find when he's older and his dad gives a little testimony about him, he says, Joseph, you were a fruitful bough. A fruitful bough that grows over the wall. You just can't stop him from his fruitfulness, the abundance in his life. And so you had those brief little glimpses of the positivity of this individual. Yes, that man. But what of the ungodly? And so we come to no, not this man. Whilst we had all positives in regards of the man and the woman that was following the Lord, here we have negatives. In fact, we have a double negative. Which sounds odd. You think, well, double negatives make a positive. That's what they used to say in physics, wasn't it? But it's a double negative. Here it says, not so the ungodly. Not so in verse 4, not so the ungodly. In actual fact, in the original it says, not so the ungodly, not so. It's almost like Jesus saying, verily, verily, most surely, I say to you. It's double emphasis there. Here, not so the ungodly. Be sure now, not so. They're completely different. The Living Bible puts it like this. What a different story for the ungodly. It doesn't translate the words, it translates the thought. What a different story for the ungodly. It's a different, there is no comparison to it. And sometimes even the ungodly, when they come across something that is so godlike, they look at it. And even though their heart's desire is not towards it, you have someone like Balaam that can look at those in the children of Israel, look at them and say, oh, that my end might be like theirs. I want to have an end like theirs. When they leave this world, they have something that I most surely don't have. And you come across these characters that are just warm. When I came into the church, that Elim church at that time, I remember walking in thinking, I went home at the end of the first night and I thought, what is it that they've got? Too frightened to say to anybody, not even Judith, because I was frightened she might think something different to me. And I didn't mention it to anyone. Went to work the next day and I remember talking to a man that I was working with, Arthur Gay. He was in the pump house. And I said to him, oh Arthur, I saw my band's being called out last night. Went to church, I came out. I said, I was so uncomfortable. What's a funny thing? He said, man, that's a funny thing. At a pump, big piston pump, steam pump. Boom, 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 boom. So we're talking, and I sat on this, and you could fry an egg on it, I sat on it, having a nice walk, 7 o'clock in the morning, of the day. And he said to me, in fact, I didn't go on the Monday, I stayed home. It was the Tuesday. And I said to Arthur, I was in church on Sunday night, Arthur, felt so uncomfortable there. They just seemed so different to what I expected. Arthur turned around and said, funny thing, whenever I go to church, I always feel better. I don't work. No, what a mess. Not so the ungodly. Not so. No, not this man. Not this man. Don't go down this road. We find with the ungodly, verse 4 tells us this. Not so the ungodly. They are like the wind, or like the chaff, that the wind drives away. Strange, isn't it? Because when we were reading about the blessed man, we find that he had roots, that he was planted, that he had foundations, that he was fruitful. There was an abundance. I quoted that verse from the Psalms, wasn't it? The trees of the Lord are full of sap, absolutely bursting out. Just cut the bark like that and just pour out. And in South America, don't they? So they get the different things that they tap from the trees. The trees of the Lord are full of sap. Not so the ungodly. They don't have no roots. They have no foundation. They have nothing like that to hold them strong. They are like the chaff which the wind drives away. Just takes it away. We've seen those westerns, haven't we? The old westerns now, where you see the hay tumbling through when the wind picks up. It's just the chaff which the wind drives away. That's not chaff. That's just a thing of hay or whatever it is that goes through tumbleweed, they call it, don't they? But we find with the chaff that the place of where winnowing the wheat would be on an elevated position where there's a draft towards the evening, and there'd be an evening breeze, and they would throw the wheat up into the air, and the chaff would be blown away, and the corn and wheat would fall back down to the ground there for them to thresh. So the chaff which the wind drives away. The Living Bible says this concerning this 4th verse. For the ungodly, what a different story it is. In comparison to what we've just heard in verses 1 to 3. What a different story is being told here. There's no comparison. There's no comparison. And there are times when you sit down with people. Tomorrow, God willing, the family wanted to look at Psalm 23. And so I'm looking at it from one perspective, really. Because Judah's father used to sit the 2 boys down, Jeremy and Mark, and they talk of their dreams. When he was playing football, I want to play for Barcelona, perhaps. I remember going to Menorca, and we sent the first time we went abroad, and we bought Gary Lineker t-shirts, Barcelona shirts. There they are on the back, and their names written on the back. And the smiles that the Menorcans gave as they were walking by. He had dreams. Mark wanted to play Augusta. He wanted to play in this, that, and the other. And they turned to rugby and all these different things, the dreams. I remember he would sit them down and say, boys, always remember this. There is no greater jewel than to be content. No greater jewel than to be content. To be satisfied. To be happy. And so we'll perhaps look at that tomorrow, because it's a subject that's really applicable to the whole of the family. Searching for that point where you have enough, but you never have enough. Henry Ford was asked what wage will satisfy the ordinary worker, and he quoted it like this: just a little bit more than he's already got. Just a little bit more than he's already got. And so here we find concerning the godly, they're planted, they're rooted, they're foundations, they're well watered, they're fruitful. But the ungodly, not so these. They are like the chaff which the wind drives away. Isaiah the prophet later on looks a little further, and he says in chapter 3, an obscure verse really, in verses 10 and 11, all is well for the godly. Tell them that a great reward awaits them. Tell the ungodly, though, your doom is sure. You shall get your reward. Your punishment is on the way. Frightening terms, really, isn't it? Frightening terms. Tell the godly that all is well for them. Tell them there's a great reward awaiting them. Tell the ungodly, though, that your doom is sure. You shall get your reward and your punishment is on the way. What a different story. it is between the godly and the ungodly. We talk about Psalm 23, and you feel that everybody in the world should be able to experience Psalm 23. But really you can't get to Psalm 23 until you read Psalm 1. That's the key to the whole of the book of the Psalms. That's the key, to find out what path you're on. Once you find out what path you're on, then the book becomes relevant to you. And it begins to speak to you of, watch that way, go this way. So we find here, verse 5 tells us this: the ungodly shall not stand in the judgment, nor sinners in the congregation of the righteous. Spurgeon, I think, was a little bit brash when he said, it is better for a sinner to go to hell than to heaven, for he'll never cope with the beauty and the wonder and the holiness of heaven. It would be a cruelty to him and to her. I think he's overstepping the mark almost in regards to that, because you can misunderstand what he's saying. But here we find concerning the ungodly, they cannot stand in the judgment, nor sinners in the congregation of the righteous. It's a frightening place to be. I think in the Living Bible it says this. Where have I got it here? It is not safe for the ungodly in that day. It's not a safe place to be. You read the final judgment back in the book of Revelation. It's a terrifying story. There's no clock on the wall. And there's time and there's space for everyone to come before the judgment seat. And there we stand. And David says this, doesn't he? If you, Lord, should mark iniquity, who should stand? Who's going to be able to stand? If you just mark iniquity once, just bring it up once, and that's what Jesus said, didn't he, when that woman came? He that has not sinned, let him cast the first stone. He's marked iniquity. And it all fell silent, and they left, interestingly, from the youngest to the oldest. The oldest ones, willful, see. Willful. Won't budge an inch. In that rut. You can't change me, you won't change me, it's too late to change. It's never too late to change. Ian Paisley in Ireland, in Belfast, went to someone who gave their life to Christ in the latter moments of their life, well into the decades, 80s or 90s. He led her to the Lord. It's never too late, see. It's never too late. The ungodly shall not stand in the judgment, nor sinners in the congregation of the righteous. To enter the kingdom there, you have to enter it here. To stand with the people of godliness there, you have to stand here. You can't be something else. There's no room to maneuver here when we talk of these things. To enter the kingdom of God there, you have to enter it here. This is where the entrance is. This is where the gate is. Here. Be it in Penyrheol, be it in Borcrew, be it in Treharris, be it wherever it is, Penclough, wherever. That's where the gate is. Not necessarily in churches. It could be anywhere. It could be by the kitchen sink if you want. You can give your life to Christ there and then. As sheep is separated from the goats, as tares are separated from the wheat, so the godly are separated from the ungodly on that final day. You cannot stand in the congregation of the righteous. But I know him. I know. It was a comfort for me when I first went into the church. I knew Barry Tyler. I knew him, Granville's son. I knew Granville. I knew David. Could I work with him? I knew Martin Rees because he was in an outstanding rugby team. He was about 4 or 5 years older than me, but they had an outstanding rugby team. And if he did, I think they beat all the big schools in Leith, in southern Wales. And so I knew Martin, and it brought a relief to me once that you walk into an area and you don't know anyone, and it makes you feel uncomfortable. But that was no bargaining tool for me to get into heaven. I know him. I went to school with him. I could talk to them. Barry would talk to me on the street in the middle of an open air, come across the road and talk to me. I knew him. I knew Granville. I knew David, all these different ones. But that's no bargaining tool. It's knowing him. Mm-hmm. That's where it all lies. Verse 6 in closing. The Lord knows the way of the godly, but the way of the ungodly shall perish. It means this: the Lord is knowing the way. He is completely familiar with it. It says this in the Psalms, doesn't it? He showed his way unto Moses, and his acts unto the children of Israel. That way, it means well-trodden path. And so, you know that path that Israel walked? Initially, it was going to be for about a year, 18 months, or whatever it was. But it ended up 40 years. It was a well-trodden path. The Lord had walked over it. I said this morning, didn't I? We used to play in woods, and there would be well-trodden paths. And you'd border the stingies and the brambles. And you'd be looking for dock leaves. If there was any stingies about as you were walking on that well-trodden path, then the stingy got it. And so when they walked through the wilderness for 40 years, Jehovah never got lost. He'd been up and down that road to make it a well-trodden path so that Moses could follow. It's a lovely way of looking at it. His eye is on the sparrow, and I know he watches me. He knows the way I take, and when he has tried me, proved me, I'll come forth like gold. I know the way, or he knows the way, the path I've trodden on. But it says concerning the ungodly, they shall perish. I've set before you now, really, life and death, blessing and cursing. Which one will you choose? Life or death? Blessing or cursing? What path are we on? What path are you on? The path that leads to life, that sometimes is narrow, or the path that is broad and open, that leads to destruction? May you choose the right path and stay on it. I think it was Jeremiah was told this: seek out the old paths. Do you know, I think some of the old religious paths have got cobwebs on them now. I've noticed in the garden, I don't know if you do a little bit of deadheading. If you notice the cobwebs between the flowers now, because you haven't been so regular through there, and they form their cobwebs. There's some old religious paths that got cobwebs on them now, that they haven't been walked over for a long, long time. May you find that old path and push those cobwebs aside. Walk in paths that the saints walked in generations ago, so that when you meet them up in the heavens, you will say, Paul, I walked the same path that you walked. Lord, I walked the path that you walked. Seek out those old paths. Well, that's it for this evening.